As Europe accelerates deeper into this debt spiral, the human impact will be profound and immediate. Ordinary citizens who have long taken stability for granted will experience the consequences first and most directly. Household budgets will be stretched beyond limits as taxes rise, public services deteriorate, and prices for essential goods soar. Energy costs, healthcare expenses, and food prices are all projected to increase sharply as the euro weakens and import costs escalate. Families will struggle to maintain their standard of living, and millions could face unemployment or underemployment as businesses grapple with higher borrowing costs and declining consumer demand. The societal consequences will be equally severe. With governments diverting ever larger portions of revenue to debt service, social programs will shrink dramatically. Healthcare systems may experience shortages of staff and essential equipment. Educational institutions could face program cuts and facility deterioration, and social welfare programs will be reduced just when they are most needed. The widening gap between rich and poor could accelerate social unrest, protests, and political polarization. Populist movements may gain unprecedented momentum, exploiting widespread frustration and fear, further destabilizing national governments and European unity. Banks, already under strain, could be the epicenter of the next wave of collapse. Holding roughly 4.2 trillion euros in government and corporate debt, even minor disruptions in debt servicing or market confidence could trigger widespread bank failures. Recapitalizing the European banking system would require resources that no government currently has readily available, and failure to act could freeze credit markets, leaving businesses and households without access to loans, mortgages, or investment capital. The resulting chain reaction would amplify the economic collapse, pushing Europe into a full-scale financial emergency that could last years. Political instability will compound these challenges. Governments across Europe will be forced to make impossible choices, balancing debt repayment against social stability. Decisions on austerity, taxation, and spending cuts will provoke fierce public opposition, potentially destabilizing democratic institutions. Some countries may resort to emergency measures or authoritarian policies to enforce compliance, while others could experience civil unrest or mass protests. The Eurozone itself could fracture as individual nations pursue conflicting policies, undermining decades of European integration and cooperation. Three scenarios remain, each with far-reaching consequences. Coordinated restructuring could allow the banking system to survive, but at enormous social and economic cost, with millions experiencing lower living standards. Sequential national defaults could fracture the Eurozone entirely, reversing decades of integration and triggering global economic disruption. Unlimited ECB monetization could prevent immediate defaults, but would likely trigger hyperinflation, eroding the value of savings and purchasing power, hitting the middle and lower classes the hardest. Each path comes with dramatic political, economic, and human costs, and all are essentially unavoidable unless radical reforms are implemented immediately. History shows us that financial crises of this magnitude leave lasting scars. Past European crises were often contained to a single country or region. This time, however, the systemic nature of the debt means that virtually the entire continent will be affected simultaneously. Governments, banks, and citizens alike will face unprecedented challenges, and recovery, if it is even possible, could take decades. Unlike previous crises, no international bailout or coordinated intervention is likely to fully contain the impact, as the scale of debt now exceeds the capacity of any single institution or group of nations. The timeline is urgent. Each year of delay increases the magnitude of the inevitable correction. By the early 2030s, debt service costs could consume the majority of economic output, forcing governments to make impossible trade-offs. Social programs, public infrastructure, and citizens' quality of life will be directly sacrificed to meet financial obligations. This is not a distant warning, it is a rapidly approaching reality. Europe's debt spiral is self-reinforcing and accelerating, and every delay magnifies the economic, social, and political consequences. Citizens will face a reality where public trust in governments and institutions erodes sharply. Banking collapses, defaults, or inflationary policies will reduce household savings, destroy pensions, and undermine confidence in the euro. Social cohesion will weaken as inequality rises and public services fail. Political polarization will intensify, with some nations pursuing aggressive nationalist policies, while others attempt austerity measures that may provoke unrest. The fabric of European society, once stable and prosperous, could be irrevocably altered. In summary, Europe is no longer confronting a theoretical debt problem. The spiral is real, accelerating, and deeply interconnected. The consequences will be economic, social, and political, affecting every citizen, business, and government across the continent. By 2030, debt service will dominate government budgets, social programs will shrink, living standards will fall, and political stability will be tested. Europe faces a structural financial collapse, and no combination of current policy tools can prevent it. The countdown is already underway, and the time for effective intervention has largely passed. The question now is not whether Europe will face a debt crisis, but how severe it will be, how quickly it will unfold, and how societies will respond when the consequences become unavoidable. Every indicator points to one conclusion: Europe is entering the most dangerous economic period in its modern history, and the impact on citizens, institutions, and governments will be profound, immediate, and irreversible unless unprecedented and decisive actions are taken. Looking ahead, the trajectory of Europe's debt crisis is terrifyingly clear. Current projections show that by 2030, total European debt, including government, corporate, household, and financial sector obligations, could reach nearly 70 trillion euros. At that point, debt service costs alone would consume more than 50% of total government revenues across the Eurozone. Economies that have long relied on borrowing to fund social programs and infrastructure will find themselves trapped in a mathematical straitjacket. No amount of austerity, monetary easing, or economic growth will reverse the spiral without triggering severe societal consequences. One of the most alarming aspects of this crisis is the interdependence of European financial institutions. Banks are not just lenders, they are also investors in each other's debt. A default in one nation could instantly reduce the value of assets held by banks across multiple countries. Imagine Spain defaulting on its obligations. German, French, Italian, and Dutch banks all face simultaneous losses, potentially forcing emergency capital injections of hundreds of billions or even trillions of euros. If these injections cannot be provided, banks may collapse, freezing credit markets and halting business operations across the continent. Corporate debt adds another layer of systemic risk. European companies collectively owe more than 14 trillion euros. Rising interest rates, declining consumer demand, and reduced government spending could push many corporations into insolvency. The failure of large multinational companies would not only destroy jobs, but also disrupt supply chains across Europe and globally. For countries heavily reliant on exports, this could precipitate an industrial recession of historic proportions. Household debt, currently at 7.8 trillion euros, further amplifies the problem. As interest rates rise and wages stagnate, millions of families will struggle to service mortgages, loans, and credit obligations. Foreclosures and bankruptcies could surge, reducing consumption and deepening economic contraction. Entire neighborhoods in major cities could experience declines in property values, creating social stress and potential civil unrest. The euro itself is under threat. A loss of confidence in the European financial system could trigger massive currency devaluation. Imports would become prohibitively expensive, particularly energy, technology, and essential goods. Inflation would accelerate, eroding savings, wages, and pensions. Middle-class families, long considered the backbone of European society, would be hit hardest, seeing decades of accumulated wealth disappear virtually overnight. On a geopolitical level, Europe's crisis will ripple across the globe. International investors, wary of exposure to European debt, may withdraw funds from the continent, further driving up borrowing costs. Trade partners, including the United States, China, and emerging markets, will face disruptions in supply chains, demand for exports, and financial markets. European instability could provoke shifts in global alliances, trade policies, and strategic priorities, potentially creating international tension and economic uncertainty far beyond Europe's borders. Policy tools that leaders have relied on for decades, quantitative easing, interest rate adjustments, targeted bailouts, are unlikely to work this time. The sheer scale of debt accumulation has surpassed the capacity of any single institution or coalition to stabilize. Even coordinated fiscal transfers between European nations could only temporarily slow the spiral, not stop it. Mathematics, not politics, now dictates the outcome. Socially, Europe may face a crisis of cohesion. As governments struggle to maintain services and meet debt obligations, public trust will erode. Protest movements, strikes, and political fragmentation could intensify. Nations with stronger economies may demand that weaker economies accept austerity measures or face exclusion from collective institutions, potentially leading to the unraveling of the Eurozone itself. Citizens may experience stark reductions in living standards, loss of social benefits, and instability in essential services, healthcare, education, and public safety. The most likely sequence is a combination of defaults, partial restructurings, and monetary interventions, each with unpredictable consequences. Some governments may prioritize social stability over debt repayment, while others may attempt to preserve financial obligations at all costs. The result will be chaotic, uneven, and potentially destabilizing, not just for Europe, but for the global financial system. Europe is facing a crisis where time is the enemy. Each month of delay increases the scale of potential collapse. Each percentage point increase in interest rates accelerates the spiral. Every borrowed euro used to pay interest is a euro that could have been invested in productive growth, now feeding a vicious cycle. By the mid-2030s, if current trends continue, the European economy as a whole may be unable to service its obligations without resorting to either massive inflationary policies or formal defaults on sovereign and corporate debt. The reality is stark. Europe is approaching a systemic tipping point. The next decade will not be defined by incremental change or gradual adjustment, but by shocks, restructurings, and deep economic realignments. For governments, banks, and citizens alike, the challenges will be immense. The choices made or not made today will determine whether Europe faces decades of decline or a more catastrophic collapse that reshapes the global financial landscape permanently. The question now is not whether Europe will face a debt crisis, but how severe it will be, how quickly it will unfold, and how societies will respond when the consequences become unavoidable. Every indicator points to one conclusion: Europe is entering the most dangerous economic period in its modern history, and the impact on citizens, institutions, and governments will be profound, immediate, and irreversible unless unprecedented and decisive actions are taken.